Amaranta. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour à tous. Je vous remercie d'être présents.
Good morning to all of you. Thank you for being with us this morning for this sixth webinar.
j'espère que vous appréciez
And I
cette
hope
série
you like this series of webinar, giving you information and dealing with research in this field. I have the pleasure to have with us Oswald Kusiwende, and I hope I did not mispronounce his name. He's a colleague from Dakar, and he also works for the IIEP, but he's based in Dakar. He analyzes education policies, and Oswald has a great experience with PASEC, a lot of experience with PASEC, and I'm sure that all the colleagues present here will have a lot of questions for you. But before we move on to the presentations, I would like to introduce Oswald Kusiude, who is responsible for education policies analysis, and this since 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And you contribute a lot on the education program, on the analysis of education policies and the management of education systems. And Paul de Dakar also has a training program, a flagship program in this field, and you're involved in the education sector analysis in different countries, and everything that has to do with the cost efficiency analysis for schools. But you have a lot of experience and practical experience in quantitative analysis with PASEC. You have worked for the World Bank. You were a technical advisor, and then as the head of the division in charge of the analyzing data for PASEC, I have insisted a lot on PASEC because the course deals with the use of learning data. So before giving you the floor, Oswald, for your presentation, you will talk about the use of learning assessment data. And before giving you the floor, there will be a pool. I will ask Amaranta to share with us the screen. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I will share with you the instructions because we will be using Mentimeter. So you will find the instructions in the chat box, and I will share my screen now. I hope you can all see my screen. So you will go to menti.com and you will enter the code 11784778. You also have the possibility to scan the QR code you see on my screen, and if you have any problem to have access to one or the other, let me know. It's quite easy. You have the instructions in the chat box. Otherwise, I'll repeat once again. Go to menti.com and enter the code 11784778. 11784778. So I give you a few seconds because you're trying to probably have access to menti.com or to use the QR code, and you have, as I said, all the instructions in the chat box. Okay, let us now move on to the question. According to you, what is the grade repetition impact on student achievement? How does it impact on student achievement? We're starting to see we start seeing a few answers. Thank you to the 9 people who already answered. I give you a few more seconds so that you can answer the question. We can already see that the impact is a negative impact. 13 people have answered so far. Thank you very much. Thank you, Amaranta says Stephanie. So we'll give you one more minute to allow everybody to answer. Just a small comment regarding this webinar. Oswald will take one example with PASEC, the use for checking assumptions that are often made in the field of education. For instance, one of the assumptions concerns repetition. Does repetition have an impact or not? So far, students repeated a lot, repetition was used a lot rather, and the thinking that it has a positive impact. But the idea is, how can we use the data coming from these major international studies to check our assumptions, and how can we use these data to plan and guide education policies? That's really the purpose of this meeting and this session. So the majority think that the impact is negative. Some still believe that it has a positive impact, and others believe that it has no impact whatsoever. So before showing you the results, I will give the floor to Oswald, who will just be introducing the subject and will lead the webinar. Thank you, Amaranta. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you to all of you.
Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran?
Can you all see my screen? Asks Oswald. Yes, I can see it in French, says Stephanie. So you have to click on display settings, Oswald, and then accept. Thank you, Oswald. That was for Oswald. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure for me to just be part of this webinar and to be part of this session on the use of learning of assessments data, the idea being to monitor SDG 4 progress. So very quickly, we will deal with the crux of the matter, what is of interest to us this morning, talking about the data. And when we have data, data is used to make analysis. Analysis comes before the planning phase, which is then followed by taking into consideration the results of the analysis in planning. And we will just give some examples, and we will be able to see how we integrate the analysis result in planning. So to start with, we will just have a look at the data issue. What are data? What is data? Data is something that can be considered as a set of useful objects and to understand facts. And these facts can be either quantitative or qualitative. So data will, of course, be a collection of disorganized facts which have to be submitted to analysis and interpretations so as to be used as a piece of information for the education policy. So what will be useful here is that once the data is organized and structured, you will have to analyze the data in a specific context before you're able to consider the data as information. And this information is what will be useful and will shed some light on the education systems and how to monitor them. Today, we will be talking about national examinations or class examinations as data, and we also intend to talk about standardized evaluations and also surveys, household surveys. What is important with these learning data are, for instance, national exams. For instance, at the end of primary education, a country may organize an exam. It may also be at the end of basic education. And the idea is to ask learners to take some tests to measure their performances. And you will see that measuring this performance is usually done in reading and French and English in English-speaking countries. Or sometimes it can be in French or in mathematics. So mathematics can be the scientific matter, or you can have French or English depending on where the exam takes place. So these national exams, the purpose of them is not to collect information about the context. And since we do not collect this type of information. The use of them will be limited. If I go, for instance, in a country which organizes exams at the end of primary education, we will not ask all sorts of questions. We will just ask questions about the region or whether the child is a boy or a girl, but we don't go further. So if you want to use this data for to have useful information and then do for targeting purposes, if you want to achieve a certain type of children, you're limited. But we have also standardized assessments, which, contrary to other national evaluations, concern or are based on a sample of students. One example of that would be the PASEC, in the French-speaking region of Africa, but it is also done now in non-French-speaking countries in Africa, such as English-speaking and Portuguese-speaking countries. You have PISA 1s, you have PUTIMs, you have PROS, and all these evaluations intend to make international comparisons, but they also offer the possibility, depending on the size of the sample of students, to make national comparisons or comparisons in the country. For instance, you have regions which you should be able to compare. One example of a standardized evaluation is that, for instance, in Senegal, we have SNERS, which is a national system for the evaluation of learning results. Other countries may have their own system to collect information for standardized evaluations, and and with this type of information, the advantage is that in addition to collecting data on the performance of the students, we also take into account the family environment, the classroom environment, the school environment, and the environment outside the school. So through such an evaluation, it is possible to establish quite good links between the performances of the students and the school and characteristics outside the school. We also have what we call household surveys. The purpose of these surveys is not to collect information on learning, but rather, and more, and I was thinking about mixed ego, which is a very important component of the multiple indicator cluster surveys mix, which aim is to measure learning in schools through education modules. And these household surveys, because they measure, particularly MICS, because they measure in a quite detailed manner the learning in schools, and because they also give information on the characteristics of households, it is possible to establish links. The advantage with mix is that we do not only look at children in the schools, as this is the case with standardized evaluations or national exams, standardized evaluation like PASEC, but we will also look at children who are out of school children. And we will measure these children and see whether they have a minimum of knowledge. Mix is not the only one. You also have the demographic and health surveys of USAID, which we often know by the name DHS. So this is the type of data you may have as an analyst of the education system. Once we have this data, what type of analysis can we do with such data? I often feel like saying that data is what allows you to make analysis, but more than anything, you can plan ahead of time the type of analysis you want to carry out and collect information based on the type of analysis you want to make. Regarding the national exams data, what we have seen and observed in the education system is that when you say, well, the success rate is X and Y at the national exam, you are told that in a given subject matter, learners have this or that performance, and this performance is either good or weak. So one of the important points is that we can look at the details within one subject matter and see, when you analyze mathematics, for instance, whether children have more problems in geometry than they do in another part of mathematics. This type of analysis may be interesting and just tell us about possible changes in programs. And once we have the results of the students based on national exam data, I know where the problems are, and I know what I can act and take actions so as to improve the performance in this subject matter. Beyond the performance which of the average score, you also have certain analysis which may be very useful, because quality is not the only thing in the education system. It is also important to understand equity. And remember, then, when we talk about SDG 4 today, we talk about quality education, but we also say education, quality education for all. So it is not sufficient to have a high national performance, but it is also important that this also exists for most learners. One example I would like to share with you is that when we did the PASEC 2014, we had a dispersion. We used the dispersion data and say that if the level is high, it's because equity is weak in the education system. And you had, unfortunately, a country with a very small dispersion and nevertheless a very bad performance, which means that in this country, everybody performed bad. So what we would like to have is make sure that everybody performs well. So if quality is good, it means that the performance is good and dispersion is weak. So based on the data collected during national exams, we can make comparisons between boys and girls, we can make regional comparisons, and we can try and see whether there is any region in particular or any department in particular performing better than the others. But we will not be able to go beyond this type of results for the time being, because of course we are limited in terms of data collected. Regarding the dispersion, another point which is also important, usually we look at the average scores, and a dispersion analysis may lead us to consider, well, what is the difference or the distance between the best students and the weakest ones. We can also try to look not only at what separates the weakest pupils and those who perform the highest, but we can also look at the performance level of a pupil considered as weak and the level of performance of a pupil considered as a high performer. So this is very important when you want to analyze the education system properly, rather than saying this is average, an average performance. Girls are better than boys in reading, and boys are better than girls in mathematics. When you use that, it's really the type of data which allows you to answer a great deal of questions useful to monitor the education system. What I usually advise is to start with looking at the variance. You know, we have children which are in schools, children are in classrooms, classrooms are in schools, and schools are located in certain regions. And we immediately understand that the variation, the sources of variation and the sources of inequities, well, there are many of them. They may be due to the family background, the region, the school. So looking at all these elements will allow you, and look at this variance decomposition allows you to see that this percentage is attributed to students, another percentage is attributed to schools, and this allows you to identify the source of differences. And this is important if you want to solve inequity problems. We are in a country where we have noted that the different performances between the students could be explained most of the time, 80% of the time, by the differences, excuse me, so I repeat, this difference in the performance of students could be explained for 80% by differences in family backgrounds. And the Ministry of Education, as the main element of monitoring the system, does not have the possibility to act on family conditions. You can immediately see that this goes beyond the education system and the Ministry of Education. Well, such an analysis will allow you to say, okay, be careful. We're going to invest a lot in the education system, but the results will still be weak. We maybe should discuss with our colleagues from the Ministry of Economy and to see how we can just focus on equity in the education system based on equity at the economic level. We can also make analysis, causal analysis, identifying or carrying out polls or using PASEC and analysis, and a traditional analysis looking for efficiency factors. So at the level of the students, the teachers, the head teacher and the school, what are the factors which allow you to understand the scores of the student? For instance, the fact that you're a girl, is this positively or negatively linked to performance? So the big challenge here is not so much to carry out an analysis, but rather to see how you interpret the results. Very often you can see analysis carried out, but the interpretation of such analysis is just a causal interpretation. We will come back to repetition later because you often hear about the negative impact of repetition. Saying that the repetition has a negative impact is not the same thing as saying repeaters perform less than those who do not repeat. In the first case, when you say that repetition has a negative impact, it is a causal interpretation, while in the second case, it's a descriptive analysis. And based on the way you interpret the results, the education policy will go in a different direction. So finally, regarding household surveys, we can make an analysis per region, per gender, per age group. You can do variance decomposition between the students if we know the origin, for instance, the school in which all these students go. You can also look for factors, but when you carry out this survey on the household, this analysis, which does not collect information on schools, this research, this analysis or this research with households will be limited to the factors we have measured, i.e. the family characteristics. So to conclude this very first part of our morning webinar, I would like to share with you some of the lessons one can draw from these assessments and evaluations. Later this morning, we will focus on repetition. So I'm not going to talk about repetition now. And one of the lessons we have learned from the implementation of standardized evaluations is that in-service teacher training is not necessarily related to the academic performance. And this is something which can be different in a country, but this is what we usually see. What we also know is that having a certificate of professional competence is positively correlated with the academic performance. We also know that girls perform better than boys in reading, and in mathematics, it's just the opposite, where boys perform better than girls. Now, see, this is just a stereotype. And in many countries, we look at that. It means that you have to encourage girls to be attracted to mathematics. You have to increase their interest in scientific fields. And for boys, you have to encourage them to like reading and encourage them to like everything that has to do with literature. And we also know that the children coming from poor families perform do not perform as well as those who come from wealthy families. And we, of course, know that the books, school books, is one of the factors which is the most cost efficient if one is interested, of course, in improving the individual performances of each of the students. So this is, Stephanie, what I want to say. I will stop now for the first part of this presentation. And if you have questions, I will answer these questions with pleasure before we continue.
Merci beaucoup, Oswald.
Thank you very much, Oswald, and thank you for sharing your experience. This was very valuable. I just wanted to get back on some of the things that were said. Thank you very much for shedding light over the different types of analysis. That was very important because some analysis can only be valuable when based on valuable data. Back when I worked with SACMEC, I realized that there seemed to be a much wider variation between pupils among countries when it comes to reading when compared with mathematics, generally speaking. I don't know if that's the case everywhere. I've noticed that there were very little difference, little variation within one country between reading and mathematics. However, generally speaking, there were much more differences between pupils when it comes to reading than when it comes to mathematics. And I looked at the existing literature and at what Bella, a sociologist, I don't know if you know her, she has done a lot of work on the sociological aspect of education, and especially looking at the first years of a child. And she came to realize that variations are much wider between one pupil and another when it comes to reading, because the family background has a much larger impact on children when it comes to reading. Over the first years during which a pupil lives before they arrive at school, the socioeconomic background of the family has a much larger impact on pupils' performance. This is what indicators tell us, that it has to do with mummies and daddies and the influence that they have. Now, there's a much larger opportunity to know how to read, to have access to reading during these first years, thanks to family backgrounds, than opportunities to acquire skills in science. So what she showed, what the sociologist showed, is that there is much wider differences between pupils when they show up at school, when they arrive in school for the first time, because they already have a family because they have a lot of skills that have been acquired thanks to their family. And therefore, when pupils show up in primary education level during the first years, when it comes to mathematics, pupils have the same kind of level. Is that something that you've noticed? Yes, this is something that I have seen in PASEC, but also in my research. It is something that is rather intuitive. School's purpose is to erase learning inequalities. You can see that when pupils enter the educational system, the pupils' performance will be a direct reflection of the education system. So when pupils enter the educational system, they bring with them the skills that they have already acquired, and you need to give time to the education system so that it can have an impact on pupils. At the beginning of their learning years, pupils do not show large variations when it comes to mathematics. However, large variations are pretty expected from pupils when it comes to reading. To give you an example, we have led a research on the impact of the school size on school learning. In other words, we wanted to come up with evidence of any impact that a large class or a small class might have on the ability of pupils to learn. We know that in large classes, performances tend to drop. The thing is, what we realized through this study is that there was no such impact in second year. By the time the pupils arrive in second year, the size of the class does not seem to have much impact. However, the impact starts to be felt after the second year. In other words, the family background has much more impact to start with. Now, what about the difference between reading and math? Now, I'm just going to share my feeling, and I'm sure that some of my colleagues here will share this viewpoint. Now, it might seem like a caricature. Maths are different than reading. I do speak French. If I make a mistake, if I say the instead of if in French I confuse feminine and masculine, it doesn't matter that much. I do not need to have perfect French in order to be able to express myself and to perform well. That's number one. Number two, households which have more means, more wealthy households will probably have different impacts on their child's achievements than a poor one. In other words, we realized that pupils which helped their parents in daily chores and professional activities tend to perform better than pupils which do not. There is this notion that putting children to work at a very early age will have a negative impact on their school achievement, but that's not quite true, in that poor families that involve their children in their commercial endeavors tend to have a positive impact on the mathematics skills of their children. When you compare, when it comes to math, between different pupils coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds, there seems to be a small difference, but that's not quite the same when it comes to reading or French. pupils who are raised at home by poor families will talk in different languages at home. That will not be the case for more wealthier families whose children will talk in French at home and have more exposure to French speaking and therefore achieve better in school in French. Thank you very much, Oswald. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. I also wanted to highlight something else. Looking at active descriptive analysis, you need to be quite careful. You can say things like, this is what the situation is in my country, this is what the dispersion situation is in my country, or the average performance is in my country. And one of the things that I've learned with SECMEC is that you can't just look at one result. You always need to understand the reasons why such phenomena have been identified. And this is the reason why surveys are very important. This is how you can explore and better understand the phenomenon. I think we have a hand that has been raised by Mr. Czech. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for giving me the floor. And thank you very much, Mr. Oswald, for this presentation. That was very interesting. I, of course, have a number of questions. Number one, I would like to talk about the weight of family socioeconomic background on pupils' school results. This is something that is quite obvious, but I do not agree with anyone who would argue that this is something that the school cannot do anything about. The main issue that a pupil is faced with is the time dedicated to learning. Given the right time, anyone can learn. Regardless of whether your father is an engineer or your parents are illiterate, you still have the same capability, the same capacity. What you need is the right time. What you said is that managers or engineers' children have more time at home to develop those skills, and therefore it's up to school to come up with a way to compensate for this. I think this is what schools should do. Number two, I wanted to get back to what was said about teachers' training. I may have misunderstood what Mr. Oswald was saying, but I think that teachers' training have a huge impact on children's performance. With high-performing teachers, pupils will follow, provided they have adequate textbooks. There is a notion that good teachers have good students, and therefore I think that it is very important to make sure that the learning is supported by proper teacher training. There is also obviously a very heavy weight. It's very important to have and to supply pupils with adequate and appropriate teaching material. This is the reason why we were talking about textbooks earlier on. What is very important right now is to make sure that the students are given the right time and the right means to acquire the skills. This is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you very much, Mr. Czech. I would like to take a minute to get back to what you said before I leave the floor to Oswald. If you look at quantitative research, the school role has been identified, or at least that's what researchers have been trying to do. What they've been trying to do is to come with an evidence that what the school's purpose was and what its role was. What we realized, however, was that the number one factor that has an impact on pupils' performance is the socioeconomic background of their families. This is something that has been evidenced over and over again when it started in the 1960s. And this was a shockwave. The conclusion of such studies was that schools had no effect whatsoever. A student that arrives in school with a socioeconomic background will remain with that economic background, and school can do very little about it. Now, looking at the SACMET, what we tried is to come up with evidence about what school can do. Families have an impact on schools. Families pick the school, and therefore it's very difficult to isolate and identify what the school weight was, what the role of school was, because it's impossible to identify it, to isolate it. Why? Because schools are picked by parents, they're picked by families. Similarly, we have been unable to identify and to isolate the positive effect of teachers on pupils because this is a phenomenon that is part and parcel of the school, which again is the direct consequence of family choices. It's impossible to isolate these phenomena, and this is something that has been evidenced over and over again up till now. This is something that is still true, and it still rings true in the framework of the AI study. But now I'm going to hand back the floor over to Oswald.
Bien sûr, merci beaucoup,
Of
Stéphanie.
course, yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. And thank you so much to my colleague who raised this very important issue. I think we should shy away from biases, from prejudice when it comes to results and performance. When I can see that the result of a research or a study is counterintuitive, I try and dig deeper. What Stephanie was saying is easily understood. There's a variety of analyses that are carried out in various contexts. However, they all lead to similar results. Now we need to ask ourselves the question, why do learning outcomes move in a way that independently from teaching or teachers' performance? There are many reasons. If we had a way to carry out such surveys, we could carry out quantitative surveys and add qualitative surveys to try and better understand the results or the outcomes of such surveys. I think in Senegal, such a survey was carried out, and it was realized that the quantitative survey showed that the most experienced teachers had the lower performing pupils. The qualitative survey showed that they lacked motivation. They thought their pay was poor, and therefore it had an impact on their outcomes. You might come up with results due to quantitative survey, but you might overlook the fact that there's a lack of motivation. And you might just focus on the fact that an experienced teacher should have better outcomes. When I look at an educational system, I try to refrain from having any bias and refrain from having any prejudice. We need to make sure that we look at facts and not what we believe should be expected from an educational system. This is only based on data, on factual results, that we can reach conclusions. This is why we use data. in order to better manage educational systems. As to the good, so-called good pupils versus good teachers debates, I am not convinced. Imagine that we are looking at an excellent teacher. Imagine that you put this teacher at the head of a class made entirely of pupils coming from underprivileged children. Pupils do not have time to do their homework at home. They are busy. They need to work, and then they show up in school as if they had never been in school before. Regardless of the best efforts of this very experienced, very good teacher, I really do not see how we are going to move from poor performance to very high performance among that class. And this is the reason why I completely agree with Stephanie when she says that the socioeconomic background of a family is a very powerful driver in the performance of pupils. As to the question of how school can act in order to improve children's performance, well, I agree, school should do its best, but a pupil's performance also depends on its family background. Another very important aspect, which brings me back to what I was saying earlier on about equity, is the initialization. Someone said that common sense is the best commodity and the widest shared commodity. I do not agree with that. There are pupils who have a passion for literature, who love reading, and other pupils are going to excel in math or other subjects than French, English, or literature. I think there is such a thing as basic dotation, and this is something that we need to take into account in order to better understand why certain pupils perform better than others. As to the issue of equity, I just wanted to conclude by saying that increasingly we can see that there's a new way of measuring equity, and that takes into account that aspect. If I work more than my neighbor, it is not unfair for me to have better grades than my neighbor. This is something that we need to keep into account in order to best understand the results and best use them in educational systems planning and management. This is also something that we need to take into account in order to make sure that the counterintuitive results of quantitative studies and lighter and qualitative studies results and outcomes. So this is something that I wanted to add. Thank you. Thank you very much, Oswald. I completely share what you said. I'm sorry, Mr. Czech, but I just wanted to say that when you look at data, you tend to approach them with biases and prejudices. Nevertheless, you quickly realize that all studies go in the same direction. It is also true that we have still not identified all the reasons for such and such pupils' performance. We know that even in privileged or underprivileged pupils, in underprivileged families, some students perform very well and the other way around. Some students have very good results because for many different reasons. Sometimes it has to do with the fact that even though the families are poor, then they have a very positive image of school. And the thing is, the analysis methodologies right now focus more on what the added value of school can be. For example, in national examinations, in France, in grading, the grading does not rely on the grade at baccalaureate anymore. It focuses on the added value that school can bring. And what is the efficiency at school. And we can see that some schools that are located in more underprivileged areas have a much better added value than other schools who might be located in more privileged areas. Just because we move to the next part. Right. I agree with what you're saying. I'm not saying that family background does not have any impact. I completely agree with this. It obviously does. It does have an impact on pupils' results. However, what I'm saying is that pupils who come from privileged backgrounds have more time to dedicate to learning. This is all I wanted to say. So what you're saying is that they have more opportunities to learn. Is that right? Yes, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you. So before we move to the next exercise, did you have any other question for Oswald? Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you for giving me the floor. And thank you, Oswald, for this rather rich presentation. My connection is tricky, and therefore I might have missed a couple of things. And I wanted to ask you about the large-scale assessments. You were talking about the comparisons within one country, as well as between one region and another, as well as gender disaggregated data. I'm so sorry because my connection was too poor to understand what the point is to compare between one country and another in order to draw planning related conclusions based on data gathered among large scale assessments. Oswald? Thank you very much. This is a very relevant question. I must say I didn't delve on the subject, but since you're raising this question, I'm just going to take 2 or 3 minutes to give you an answer. Number one, international assessments have a much more impact than national ones. Look at Ivory Coast or Niger or Senegal. When each country carries out a national assessment, this is something that nobody's going to be very interested in for several reasons. Number one, because it's purely national, and therefore the purpose of such an assessment is mostly to include national stakeholders. Also, it will have less credibility. Number two, why does it have more impact internationally? Well, I would like to take the example of a country that experienced a huge change between 2014 and 2019 PASEX. International assessments are also a way to raise awareness on the fact that school performance, which is seen as the outcome of everything that is carried out on a day-to-day basis within schools, is of poor quality. Teachers have been trained, teachers have been paid, teachers have been recruited to make sure that educational quality is improving. You have improved teaching processes, you have decreased the number of strikes, you have improved the amount of textbooks that are provided to pupils, and yet the performance is bad or not good enough anyway. So this is something that helps raising awareness among decision makers on the need to take into account the different reformations and the different changes that needs to be brought to the educational system. Increasingly, we are living in a globalized country, in a globalized world. Senegal students will move to France, people from Benin will go and move to Senegal, to move to the United States to work. As an education decision maker, how do I make sure that my country's educational system has a number of skilled, competent managers and decision makers? If I am willing to make sure that students can feed into the workforce, to the labor market in my country, and then what happens if I realize that there is no matching between the expectations, the needs of the labor market and the educational system? There is something that is a concern. And therefore, the assessments has tried to rate countries when compared to others. The last PASEC was rating Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, so that ministers can look at the results and say people who have been trained in this sub-region where the assessments took place and say, right, so the pupils who did graduate have so chance to be able to move to different countries, and their skills will match that of the labor market of the region. You will see that PISA will be replicated amongst African countries in the future. This has been done by South Africa. Ghana is in the process of doing it. Why? Well, because they want to position themselves and position their learners on international standards. They want to make sure that people from Ghana, from people from South Africa can compete on an international labor market. And this is something that means that we need to make sure that the national economic system works on the one hand, but also that our learners from one country can be included in other economies.
Les apprenants pour qu'ils partent.
You might tell me that you don't train learners for them to leave, but if they don't leave, others will come and take their position. So international comparison is very useful for the ministers. Thank you. Stephanie? Thank you very much, Oswald. I propose we move on now to the exercise, and maybe you can show it on the screen and come back to the impact of repetition. We have decided to ask you this question and use this as an assumption. Do you believe that repetition has an impact on the performance of students? Because if we ask pupils to repeat, it is because we believe that the pupil has not learned everything he or she should have learned and has not acquired certain skills. So we ask the pupil to repeat to acquire what he or she did not acquire during the school year. So we have asked the question, and the majority of you said that the impact is rather negative, and repetition does not have a positive impact. As 3 people said that it had no impact at all, not even a negative one. And we also have those who said, well, it has a positive impact. So I will give the floor to Oswald, who will show you the results of PASEC 2019 on repetition. Okay, fair enough. Just to start, this is the percentage of pupils at the end of primary education who have repeated at least once. According to the PASEC 2019 results, we see that 54%, i.e. more than half of the students in the last year of primary education have repeated 1 year in primary education. The results vary from one country to the other. The champions in repetition are Burundi, Gabon, and Madagascar to a certain extent. We have countries with little repetition like Togo, Chad, Senegal, Benin, the Côte d'Ivoire, Congo, and there are other countries where repetition is not as high. This is the case in Niger, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. As to the impact of repetition, this is a part of the exercise. So maybe we can look at the next graph and ask you what you think. But what I was saying is that as a manager of the education system, I am not interested in what happens for a given student. You have students who will be asked to repeat a class, and the year after, these students will perform much better. This may happen, but what I'm interested in as the manager of the education system is the trend, the average. What happens in the education system when I ask pupils to repeat? Not teachers, but pupils. From a pedagogical point of view, just from the pedagogical point of view, many analyses have shown that on average, students who repeated a class do not perform better than those who have not repeated them, which means that the pedagogical impact of repetition can be questioned. What is my purpose as a teacher if I want a student or a pupil to repeat? What I want is for the pupil to improve his or her performances, and I realize that this is not the case. And there are other students who have just arrived and they perform much better than the one who is repeating. So we therefore have to make sure then when we implement an education practice, it has to be beneficial for all. So from that point of view, it is a problem. The second problem is a quantitative one, because so far we have been discussing quality, but repetition is a break when it comes to enrollment. A pupil who repeats a class means that this is one seat less for another pupil who should have been in the education system, which means that repetition actually hampered the enrollment of another pupil. And of course, it slows down the progress towards SDG 4, because for education to be a good quality education for the pupil has to be in the education system. So from this point of view, repetition just slows down enrollment. But before this pupil repeated, he or she entered into the education system, used resources from the education system, and because he or she repeated once or twice or three times, he or she ended up giving up. And repetition always comes before just leaving school and becoming out of school children. And these children who are out of school children cannot efficiently participate in the economic life of the country. So it's a loss for the country. So we can quantify this kind of loss and this kind of waste through what we call internal efficiency coefficient, which many countries calculate. And you will see that in many countries, sometimes up to 15% of the resources in education are used to finance repetition or just dropouts. So one should just ask oneself questions about this practice, repetition practice. And this is not something you see in Africa only, but in countries like Australia, for instance, there is no repetition before the last year of secondary education. In OECD countries, for instance, Portugal, where the level of repetition is the highest, is the one where performances tend to be the lowest. So as you can see, you finance repetition, you slow down enrollment, and you do not get the results you were expecting. So therefore, one can wonder about the usefulness of repetition. So before we move on I will ask you to interpret the graph on the next slide. But in PASEC 2014, we have noted that the repeaters have better performances than those who did not repeat. And somebody interpreted that as a positive impact of repetition. But this is not the case. In a country like Burundi, and this is something you see in many African countries, is that repetition used the flows from one cycle to the other, depending on the seats available. So repetition is used as a tool to manage flows. And therefore, we have in the 6th year, children or pupils who have taken an exam but did not pass the competitive exam to enter into the 1st year of secondary education. So they will repeat simply because the parents cannot pay for the private school. So those who repeat are children who were good performers, but pupils whose parents do not have the financial resources to enroll them in a private school. So they're not real repeaters, but they repeated the year because there was no seat for them in the next year. So this may lead us to wonder about the efficiency of this policy. And once again, if we only focus on quantitative results without trying to understand why we have such results, we will not be able to efficiently monitor the education system. So this is definitely what I wanted to say regarding repetition in PASEC countries. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Osval,
Thank you, Oswald,
d'avoir accepté qu'on prenne cet exemple.
for accepting to take this example, the repetition, which is highly questioned, but there are still people who believe it has a positive impact. When I worked for SACMEC, we tried to ask ourselves why there were so many students and pupils who had repeated at the end of primary education. The figures were extremely high, and we really wondered why 50% or 75% of the pupils had repeated at least once, if not twice or 3 times. And we realized that in SACMEC, the impact was rather negative, because once you repeat, you tend to repeat more and more, and then you simply drop out. That's a reality. So we tried to understand why, and we realized that often qualitative research has proved that why not the repeat if you have really given a great deal of thought to the factors which did not allow the student to learn what happened. So if you really work on these factors and you're able to identify these factors and you try to come up with a solution, then maybe repetition could have a positive impact. But if you repeat in the same conditions, it is of no interest, because you have not solved the problem. You have not thought about the problem, and you only think, well, the student was not able to do this and that. But if you think about why the pupil was not able to learn, then you can come up with a solution. And in this case, repetition can be beneficial, theoretically, of course. This is the reason why in our societies, schools have decided to let people move on to the next grade rather than ask them to repeat, because the impact is most of the time negative. I think Mr. Sheikh wants to make a comment on this point. Yes, thank you. Yes, I have a comment. Thank you very much to Mr. Oswald, and thank you to Stephanie for giving me the floor. What we can say is that repetition is not a good thing, because normally education should take place in a span of so many years. So normally you should be able to study during so many years and then move on to the next step in the next cycle of education. But now I just want to talk about the possibility to learn in certain cases, because some repetitions can be positives and others may have no impact. If you look at the very first years of education, when you learn to read and write, for instance, in my country, the student has 2 years to learn to read. And in France, it's 1 year. But in my country, we don't teach reading mechanisms. You ask people, pupils to decipher the letters. And if you have someone who cannot read, that's really something that is a difficult weight for the teacher who has to help the student. So in that case, repeating can have a positive impact for the student who will learn reading. But but beyond the 3rd grade and up to the 4th grade, if you have students who cannot read, it means that they will repeat many times. And if they repeat, it will have no impact because they cannot read. And the student who cannot read cannot learn anything beyond the 3rd grade. And that's where the problem lies. Regarding the 6th year, which is the last year, as Mr. Oswald said, there is a bottleneck there because the number of seats in secondary education, lower secondary education, is not always sufficient for the number of students in the 6th grade in primary education. So we have pupils who could continue in secondary education, but there's no seat for them. So they will just drop out. And this is really a pity. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you very much to all of you once again. Thank you, Mr. Check. We are just a bit late. What I propose, Oswald, if you agree, is rather to analyze the graph together, because we don't have the time to do an additional work. So if we could analyze it together, and if you could show us, that would be great. Does repetition have an impact on school performances for PASEC? And I believe we had decided to take the case of 3 countries.
Burundi, il y avait le Sénégal.
So we took Burundi, Senegal. Yes. Burundi, Guinea, and Niger. Could you give us some information about this graph? The results of the PASEC are very important. The graph that you can see here is a chart that highlights the pupil's performance when compared or in view of the number of years repeated. The square shows students who never repeated a grade. Round are students who repeated a grade once. Losanges are students who repeated a grade twice, and triangles show students who repeated more than 2 years. One thing that you need to take into account is the number of squares are always on top, regardless of what country we're talking about. We're talking here of students who never repeated a class. The first lesson that needs to be drawn from this chart is that students who never repeated a year, not even once, perform better than students who have. And this is true regardless of the number of years that have been repeated. From a theoretical viewpoint, you can therefore come up with one conclusion. From an empirical viewpoint, you realize that students who never repeat the grades always perform better. As to the number of years that have been repeated and the impact that it has on the performance. Now, this will depend on the subject and from the country. You can see here that it's obvious that when it comes to reading, which is shown in blue, as opposed to math, which is shown in green. You can notice that in countries such as, let's take the example of Burundi, for example. In places like Burundi, the round shape that stands for students who repeated the grade once is better than the losange, which is for students who repeated the grade twice, as opposed to a triangle. So each year repeated puts you down in the general outcomes. However, this is not necessarily the case in other countries. In other words, there might be a direct correlation between the number of classes repeated in certain countries, but not necessarily in other countries. This is notwithstanding the fact that students who never repeat a grade always, without exception, fare better than students who do repeat a class. The general conclusion of this graph is that students who never repeat a grade perform better in all countries. Moreover, depending on the countries and depending on the subject, the number of years repeated does not always have a positive impact on school performance. Stephanie? Thank you very much, Oswald. Is there any question? Would you like to comment on this? I would also like to say that in TechMact, we could see very wide variations between countries. You can see that there's not only performance on the one hand, but there's also the issue of classes repeated on the other hand. We also came to the conclusion that students who never repeated a grade performed better, and that was very clearly evidenced. The more years were repeated, the lower the results, the school performance was at the end of primary education. If there's no other question, and I know that it's a very fascinating subject, and this is something that has an impact on what drives these phenomena. So there's also a number of countries where there are differences between girls and boys, for example, which is not necessarily the case in other countries. There are also differences between regions, which doesn't happen in other countries. For example, in South Africa, there were very large differences between one region and one state and the next, which was not the case in Zambia across the board. So, Oswald, may I suggest that we move to the second part of your presentation, which has to do with how to best use the data that you draw from such surveys. Absolutely. Just going to move to the next slide. Now, once you have collected all the data, regardless of what source you collect them with, once the analysis has been carried out, you need to move to the planification or planning. There's a lot that is being said in IPE about sector planning, educational planning. Needs to be based on data. It's a systematic and rational analysis, and its application to the process of educational development. The purpose of this process is to make sure that education and training meet more effectively the needs and the aims, the objectives of both students and society. We can see here very clearly that the purpose of education is to meet society's needs. Therefore, we need to identify the needs of society. But first and foremost, you need to look at the objectives of the society's students. This is a definition that is useful for us when we start looking at what planning is.
Professeur.
Je pense que peut continuer. Donc, la
I'm
planification.
going to continue. So planning
Une étape
is
précédée
a step
en œuvre même
that is done.
prévu. Donc, planifier quelque chose,
You need to plan beforehand.
une étape vers sa mise en œuvre. Si vous mettez
It's a step towards the implementation.
planifier, c'est que vous faites en sorte que, en fait, ce que vous voulez faire ne marche pas.
You need to do this in order to make sure that the implementation will be as effective as possible.
Prioritaire dans le plan.
You need to do this as a reflection of the main intervention priorities of the plan.
On connaît les résultats de l'analyse.
You know that an analysis is carried out, then conclusions are drawn, then objectives are drawn or identified based on the conclusions of the surveys. And these are objectives towards which you're going to work. And therefore, there's a number of what we call domains of priority interventions. These must reflect the issues that have been identified during the diagnosis. Let's look at repeating classes. If this happens a lot in one country, and if your objective in terms of quality control is to reduce the number of pupils who repeat their class, means that you're going to have to plan ahead for a number of steps, a number of decisions that are going to be made in order to reach that objective of reducing the number of pupils repeating the years or subjects. This is the only way to operate if you want to make sure that you act in the most efficient possible way. Good planning is the best way to reach your objectives. Now, how to take into consideration the analysis outcomes within planning. Let me give you a few examples. We have looked at the issue of repeating the years. If in any given country, the educational system wants to limit the amount of pupils who repeat their years to 5% nationally. In a country like Senegal, the percentage is specific. In Senegal, repetition is prohibited within cycles. However, between cycles, repetition is allowed. What do I mean by cycle? Well, a student cannot repeat their first year, but they can repeat the second, meaning that the cycles are 2 years. One cycle is 2 years, and the repetition of the first of each cycle is banned. However, there also is a ceiling limitation to the number of repetitions that can take place throughout any pupil's educational cycle. Why? Because there is an increasing awareness that repetition of years does not carry a lot of value. Another example has to do with programs to support girls in mathematics and boys in literary disciplines. In many countries, including ours, pupils who are involved in scientific classes include very few girls. Sometimes as few as 5 girls in 40 pupil classes. Similarly, in literary classes, there is a limited number of boys that are enrolled. this might be seen as a problem, and this needs to be taken into account. And this is something that is increasingly the case in a number of countries that we work with. We came up with a simulation, and this will help move or steer an increasing number of girls towards science classes, both in general or technical scientific education. We can work with educational systems to objective of gender equality within classes as a way to improve educational offer. Another example that can be mentioned has to do with curriculum reforms. If you carry out a PESEC style assessment, you might realize that there might be high-performing students in math, but less so in reading. And if you look at reading education, you might realize that maybe grammar is an issue or vocabulary is poor. Now, as this assessment took place nationally, the country will be able to rethink the curriculum on the one hand, or to maybe provide specific help to students. However, without any analysis, without any data or reliable information on that particular topic, no reasonable reform can be envisioned, can be even foreseen without any data. You need to make sure that any reform that will take place will need to be grounded and based on data and on facts. No reform can take place without objectives, without assessments. And in order to do that, you need to remember that reforms will aim at tackling specific aspects of one specific subject.
Last point, which is the most difficult, is the training of teachers. And as I said earlier on, it's not always connected to the performance of students. Maybe we should maybe just add that the analysis which allows to just come up with this conclusion is not a causal analysis. And maybe if we just look at the impact of teachers' training, maybe that would be better. But the surveys and the studies are carried out with a certain rigor. And I'm not sure that the results in a causal analysis would be completely different when you assess standard learning performance. It's not because I say that the training of teachers is not always correlated to learning that this result will be true for all countries. It may not work in Burundi, but work in Burkina Faso. It may not work in Togo, but works in Senegal. So once again, planning should be based on data and should be based on facts. It must be a factual exercise, and you must use the results of your diagnosis to envisage or to just develop an efficient and cost-effective planning. Before you start thinking about a new house, let us continue and give some examples where it is necessary, for instance, to take into account positive discrimination. This may happen during planning. For instance, you are interested in the design of a library, and you may consider that in rural areas, households are poorer, and since they're poorer on average, there are less possibilities, learning possibilities for students because they don't buy books. and it's mainly in schools that they will learn. So a library in a rural area could be preferable to a library in urban areas. So this kind of positive discrimination may be useful for the education system. Earlier on, we talked about the training of teachers, which is not globally beneficial, but they're nevertheless a specific training which allow to improve learning. We know, for instance, that the size of classrooms has a negative impact on school performances, and this may, and we may just train a teacher how to manage large classrooms and to develop the necessary pedagogical skills for that. We know that we can also promote less repetition, but for that we have to allow teachers to identify the pupils with difficulties and to support them. So a specific training can have a positive impact in this field. And if we see that the impact is positive, then we may decide to roll it out later. So these are some types of training which can be useful. We also know that school books are are amongst the most cost-effective tools. They do not cost a lot, but they have a massive impact on the training, on the performances of students. So you may prefer to have large classrooms because classes, because analysis have shown that of course, a large size classes has negative impact on quality, but not it's not necessarily dramatic. And to compensate for this negative impact, you can buy school books for each pupil. So globally, you will spend more when buying textbooks, but this is better than just building a new classrooms by just trying to reduce the size of classes. So the free distribution of textbooks can be an important element in the education policy. And school teaching time is something which in many countries leads to discussions. If there is not enough sufficient teaching time, well, children and students don't learn. You have to make sure that the planned teaching time is something teachers respect and comply with. We know that, of course, there may be strikes, of course, but the problem is the problem of absenteeism. World Bank studies show that if you go in a country and enter a school, 27% of the teachers were not there. That's one day. So how many days in a year are these teachers absent? So you can see that this school teaching time and this exposure to learning are things that are very important if you really want the education system to improve in terms of quality for children. Teacher qualification requirements, this is also something that is important. Some countries have revised this following learning assessments. The problem, once again, here is that you have to be very careful when you realize that evaluation of learning performances, and this is something that is qualitative, so your analysis must be descriptive. For instance, the teachers with the baccalaureate perform better than those who just have a BPC. It doesn't mean that who have studied, who went to university. This doesn't mean that the academic level is not sufficient, but it means that teachers with the baccalaureate only to teach in urban schools, while those who have who went to university are in rural schools, whereas things are more difficult. So it is sometimes very difficult to identify the causal effect if you don't really carry out a thorough analysis. So you have to be able to take a step back and analyze in a very detailed manner all the data before coming up with conclusions which may have a dramatic effect on the education system. And finally comes the improvement of school infrastructures. Many analyses have shown that school infrastructure has a significant impact on learning outcomes. And when we talk about school infrastructures, we talk about toilets, separate toilets for boys and girls, the water points, and the fact that children, pupils should learn in well-structured classrooms with roof where you can learn without being worried, where the teacher feels safe. Oh, Oswald has disappeared. Oh, there he is. That's the link we should that should exist between the quality of school infrastructure and the school or the gross enrollment rate. You know that this is just a quantitative indicator. When I say that we have a gross enrollment rate of 90% in primary education, it simply means that in my education system, I have the possibility to enroll children from the age of 6 to 11. I can enroll 90% of them. It does not mean that the infrastructure is sufficient. You will see that in countries where the weather conditions change a lot, and this has to do with the crisis-sensitive planning. So in such countries, the gross enrollment rate in the bush, this if there is a fire in the bushes, all the classrooms will be burnt, and the year after you may have a gross enrollment rate which instead of 90% will be 75%. So you really need to improve school infrastructures to maintain children and pupils in schools and allow them to learn properly in the education system.
Les éléments que j'avais prévu de discuter avec vous ce matin.
These were the things that I wanted to share with you today. Stephanie, back to you. Thank you very much, Oswald, for this second part of your presentation. That was very interesting. It's already 12:41 in Paris, so maybe to put an end to this session, did you look at the questions? Est-ce parce que les étudiants qui n'ont jamais redoublé s'en sortent mieux, ou est-ce que les étudiants qui ont des meilleurs résultats ne redoublent jamais? Il est rationnel de comparer les étudiants qui redoublent, donc les redoublants, par rapport avec ceux qui n'ont jamais redoublé et comparer leurs performances. You want to assess the results of an educational policy. Ideally, what you want to do is to compare a person with themselves instantly. However, this is not technically possible. You want to look at a pupil if both in the situation where such pupil does repeat the year and does not repeat the year, which is impossible. So what you want to do is maybe to compare between two twins. So what we do is to imagine that a student will be their own student, with their own. You can't do this immediately, and therefore you have to wait for a couple of months. Now, in those couple of months, a lot of things can have changed. New circumstances, new environments. In the literature assessing impacts, it's better to look at and to consider an instantaneous assessment as opposed to a long time assessment. this is what I would suggest. Maybe instead of waiting for several months and then carry out a comparison, maybe a real-time comparison is better. Thank you very much, Oswald. Generally speaking, we know that pupils who repeat several years tend to have poorer performance, but that's not quite the case everywhere. You need to shy away from generalizations. For example, in Burundi, there are other reasons why a large number of pupils repeat their classes, which is exactly what you said, Oswald. What? Now, what I'm going to do, Mr. Check, this is going to be the absolute last question today. And bear in mind that you also have a discussion forum that is open to you after the end of the webinar. Mr. Sheikh, maybe one last word. No? All right. So what I suggest is that we're going to stop here. Oswald, thank you very much for your presentation, which was very interesting. And I'm sure that the participants would like to continue this. Oswald is currently working on a case study with real data, and I think it does include the issue of years, repetition of years. But nevertheless, we still have the webinar discussion forum that you can use should you wish to share any comment or questions with Oswald. Thank you so much, Oswald, for your presentation. Thank you, Stephanie. And that's that. And I'm now on the verge of closing this webinar. I can see that a number of participants also thanked you for this very interesting presentation. Dear participants, thank you very much, and I wish you a very good day. We just shared with you the results of the group work, so you can go and look at the results on the platform. We wanted to wait until the last moment before telling you. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. Bye.
Merci Stéphanie.